I'm good.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to Mythstorie, a podcast about myths and history. I am one of your hosts, Bryant, with my permanent guest, Cammy. What's up, Cammy?
Not much. What's up with you, Bryant?
Not too much. All I know is that at least when this episode comes up, it's going to be Friday, and that's why Peter's here, because it's the every other Friday. This is the other Friday. So Peter, our other guest, is here. Hey, Peter, what's up?
Hey, how are you?
I'm fantastic. So we have a cool follow-up episode. We've timed some of the Podicus Magnuses. We don't typically try to do that, but we timed it really well this time. So Cammie and I had our normal show on Wednesday where we talked about New Orleans voodoo specifically. That was the topic, and there was some cool stuff there. We scratched the surface barely, but it was fun. And now we're going to go a little further into some things that are tied to that, and we're going to talk about the big Z word, zombies, Zeds, undead, ghouls. We'll talk about all that soon. But if you're just joining us, Mythstorie is a podcast where each week, a couple of friends, sometimes three, maybe two, like to talk about a special legend or a myth or historical thing, give you the story behind it, and then go into some of the, I like to say facts, but that's never really accurate. They're not always accurate. I'm not always accurate. But we give you some of the info behind it in the background. And I think this episode's going to be a really cool idea because we're talking about zombies, and spoilers, zombies are not real, I think.
So are they?
Are they?
That's the end of the show, I guess, if that's where you want, if you wanted. But we're going to talk about the evolution of the zombie, I think, is what we're really going to be hitting on to. And there's a lot here. There's tons of undead creatures that we could do like solo shows on and stuff. So this is going to be an all-encompassing one, kind of as we do it on the Podicus Magnus. But Cammie and Peter have some fun little stories that they're going to hit us up with. So Cammie, please regale us.
Okay. So my sources are the ever accurate Daily Mail and Wikipedia. It was May of 1962 when Clairvius Narcisse's soul departed from his body, but his story would not end there. In 1980, 18 years after his burial, he would find his sister Angelina at the local market and relay a tale so strange and inherently sinister it is almost impossible to believe. You see, Narcisse was brought back to life the day after his death. A voodoo practitioner had gone to the cemetery and dug up his fresh corpse. The man performed a ritual which restored his life, but not his soul to his body. The practitioner would keep that in a bottle and use it to control his victim. After his body was mobile, the man who was still dirty from digging Narcisse up pronounced that he was now his slave and forced him to harvest sugar on a nearby plantation. He was enslaved there for years until the plantation owner died. Narcisse claimed that he was given a potion every day until that moment. The potion made him hallucinate and caused him to be easily controlled. He was able to regain his senses and rejoin his family once he was no longer under the influence of this potent drug. His family was extremely grateful for his return, but news spread quickly beyond Haiti of this man's miraculous recovery from death. Scientists were on the case. Looking into the original autopsy reports, they found that 2 American medical practitioners had pronounced him dead back in 1962. While the people of Haiti knew this was voodoo at work, outsiders were skeptical. His village was aware of Narcisse's abandoning his children and the land dispute between him and his brother. Either of these factors could have explained why he was zombified. The practice involves feeding a live person a powdered substance containing pufferfish toxin and other mysterious ingredients. As legend had it, the man then will succumb to death and have his soul extracted by a voodoo priest. The priest will keep it in a jar and then sell the man to work in the grueling hot days on a plantation. A Haitian psychiatrist, Lamarck Douillon, believed that the powder didn't actually kill the victim, but put that person into a very deep sleep that barely registered a pulse or breathing. They would then revive the person after burial. He sent a sample of the powder to America where they ran tests on rats. The rats were administered the powder and then monitored. Their heart rates were decreased to the point where they barely registered, and they appeared not to breathe. After a few hours, the rats appeared to be dead completely. Later, they came back to life. While the science suggests the practice is based in reality, it makes it no less frightening for the people who are buried alive.
And what you don't know is when the rats came to life, they all had Romanian accents and went, blah.
Blah blah.
A taste for brains.
Right, yeah. Very nice. That is the that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about when I kind of talk about the evolution of the modern zombie. But it's the Haiti is an important focal point, a very, very important focal point as to how the modern zombie today wouldn't be the same without the influence of slavery, of Haiti, and their interaction with it in that culture. So that's really, really cool. All right. That's story one. Peter, what you got for us?
So, as you said, we're kind of looking at the origins of kind of the modern depiction of zombies. I don't know if you're going to touch on this or not, but Mythstorie was the basis for the book and movie Serpent and the Rainbow, which is a fun Wes Craven movie. So if you want to dig a little deeper, it's super creepy. It's got Bill Pullman in it. Anyway, so I'm looking at another sort of undead creature that may have influenced certainly the White Walkers in Game of Thrones, and most likely some of the creatures of Lord of the Rings, like the Nazgul and the Barrow-wights. So I'm going to be talking about the Draugr. Am I saying that right? I sure hope so.
Draugr. I think
Draugr.
Draugr. That's what Skyrim people called them. The NPCs in Skyrim. I'm pretty sure they're like, the Draugrs, kill them.
Draugr.
And they're like, Draugr. Yeah.
Yeah, with an American accent. Just make sure you get that down.
Draugr.
Yeah. If it's like a Norse word, so you just be rolling a bunch of R's. That's really it. Just
Sure.
the Draugr.
Well, there's a bunch of them in there, so
Yeah.
I'll do my best.
Right.
All right, here we go. This tale was adapted from the Erbigajar saga, which was written by an unknown author and originally published in the 13th century. I'm also kind of taking some general Draugr facts from Wikipedia and adding it to this tale. The Erbigajar saga describes the lives of several great families living on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula of Iceland. It tells how they lived and worked and loved and fought and died, and how they did not always rest peacefully in their graves. Thorolf Haltfoot was the wealthiest man in Thor's Riverdale, and he had secured his wealth by usurping his rivals, cheating his neighbors, and exploiting his thralls. Thorolf waged a bitter feud with Olaf the Bonder. Their clashings had left Thorolf with a distinctive limp. Thorolf repaid Olaf for his halting foot by burning down the Bonder's house while his enemy slept inside. All the townspeople of Thor's Riverdale agreed Thorolf Haltfoot was the most wrongful of men. Years passed, and Thorolf became more embittered with every winter. As an ale that sours after too long in the barrel, Thorolf sat in his hall and curled his fingers over the arms of his high seat. One day, Thorolf did not stir from his chair for an entire day and an entire night. He ate and drank nothing. Stout men tried to lift their chieftain from his chair, but could not. The old man had grown unnaturally heavy. Messengers were sent to fetch Thorolf's son, Arnkel, the strongest man in the village. Arnkel arrived to discover that his father had died. Rumors swirled around Thor's Riverdale that Thorolf Haltfoot would become a Draugr, an again walker. Such a greedy and troubled man would grow restless in the grave despite the gleaming treasures that surrounded him in his burial mound. A fierce hugr burned in Thorolf's cold heart, a fitful will that could animate his dead limbs. Preparations would have to be made. Arnkel began by cutting a hole in the wall of Thorolf's hall to remove his father's corpse. If the body had been carried out through the front door, the Draugr would remember how to enter the great hall. Thorolf was laid in Howe, surrounded by his favorite weapons and finest treasures. Iron was said to bind a Draugr, so a pair of iron scissors were placed on his chest. His toes were tied together, and needles were driven into his feet to prevent him from walking beyond the grave. Soon after the burial, ill omens began to appear. Even during the darkest of nights, Thorolf's grave glowed with a strange foxfire. Birds that flew over the mound dropped from the sky, dead. A shepherd claimed that any animal that grazed near Thorolf's grave would go mad. A few days later, the shepherd himself disappeared. He was soon seen staggering through town, his bones shattered, his skin coal blue. He had been murdered and turned into a Draugr. Thorolf's wife awoke one day to find her husband in the bed next to her. His skin was blackened, his body bloated, the air around him reeking of death and decay. He tormented his wife for many days until the poor woman finally went mad and died.
No.
It just keeps getting better. Afterwards, Thorolf could be seen roving out into the surrounding lands, destroying homesteads and killing many men. The men he murdered became Draugr themselves and followed Thorolf in a dread company. Thorolf had to return to his burial mound to rest between rampages, and Arnkel hatched a plan to capture the Draugr as it slept. As Arnkel crept up to his father's grave, a storm appeared out of a clear sky. The bright midday sun turned as black as coal. At the entrance to the barrow stood a great stone. As Arnkel approached the death door, Thorolf passed through the stone like a wisp of smoke. As his body became solid once more, Arnkel tried to wrap his mighty arms around his father's shoulders, but the Draugr escaped his grasp by sinking down into the earth. Back in town, an old woman taught Arnkel about trollskap, the magical abilities that the Draugr had used to thwart Arnkel's attacks. Arnkel would have to rely on more than just his strength if he had hoped to seal his father in his tomb once again. Finally, Arnkel was able to ensnare the Draugr by binding its limbs with bands of iron. It took 4 oxen to haul Thorolf's heavy body far from Thor's Riverdale. Arnkel planned to burn the Draugr and cast its ashes into the sea, but just as the shoreline came into sight, the oxen went mad and overturned the wagon. Baying and clashing, the oxen drove themselves over a cliffside and died on the volcanic rocks below. Arnkel resolved to bury the Draugr where it lay. He built a great wall of stone around the mound, so if Thorolf ever walked again, he would be imprisoned by stout, thick walls and far from the lands that he knew so well. If you visit Iceland today, you can follow a trail that traces the events of the old Norse sagas. You can walk across Snæfellsnes and marvel at its glaciers and geysers and brilliant northern lights. You can see the lands that Thorolf lusted for from beyond the grave, and who knows, you might meet the Draugr himself.
Ooh, you just can't get rid of that guy.
No, he's very persistent.
Yeah, I think we've talked about the euhemerism and how it's like the idea that real events happen and they become myth. I think this guy was just a terrible husband, and his wife like nicked him, in the 12th century.
He's a huge a-hole.
Right, and she was like, "No, he turned into a Draugr. What are you gonna do?" She just like murdered him. That's really cool. That is a really cool story. So there's a lot here. I've got some cool places to get started. The one thing I thought about that I hadn't really, because I didn't jump too much into the Draugr, but I know a chunk about Norse mythology and stuff, and I played like God of War, and I read listened to the audiobook of Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology, and they talk about Niflheim, which is the world of fog, and it's depicted as being a cold and misty place, and it's where you go if you like don't go to Valhalla, but also if you don't go to like hell, and hell is a different word. It's Hel. It's a different place and concept in Norse, but Niflheim is basically like if you die of old age, if you died, you tripped and you fell and you and stuff. It's just like boring deaths, and it's not like a place of punishment, but it's very much like a limbo. You're just kind of existing, and it's very cold, and you're just there. And I feel like, with especially like with Draugr, with turning into a Draugr, the explanation and the coldness of it. I mean, of course, if you're in Iceland and you die, you're gonna look like that, what you described. So I just think there's some really interesting stuff there. But yeah, so we have some cool stuff to kind of go off of. Cammy gave us the intro, and in short, the word zombie and sort of the idea of zombie sort of began with this voodoo Haitian thing. And listen to our episode on voodoo. We kind of go into it a little bit, but you're probably pretty familiar with voodoo and how voodoo likes to really interject itself in all facets of human life and controlling it through toxins and potions and ingredients and stuff like that. So it would make sense that you could mess with the dead and things like that. But voodoo, and I don't think we really said this in the last episode, Cammy, but voodoo really is a religion. It takes on so many, it takes on so many different facets. And so think about how religions think of the dead. And
actually, it's the number one religion in Haiti.
Right. Yeah. And I could totally see that. And it's just cool too, because just like I said, how it's changed and due to the diasporas that formed everywhere that started with voodoo anyway. But that's really kind of where it began in a lot of ways. And there's some really cool. So I'll kind of start. I read this great little piece from anthropology.msu, the history of the zombies. It gave me a lot of what I read. All the pieces that I found really kind of followed the same format. It starts with George Romero, and then it kind of goes into some other little things. And so it was kind of funny. I read through them a lot, so I'm very familiar with the base of it, but some added some cool things. And this one specifically talked about other civilizations. They didn't give a lot of information, but there's apparently an idea that the Mayans were actually destroyed by zombies. Like that's kind of what ended the Mayans. And the people tie the cannibalistic nature of, we kind of stereotype it. They did practice certain cannibalism. I don't remember. If I remember correctly, it wasn't practiced like all the time. It wasn't like always ingrained in the society, but it was practiced. There were murals and there was art that depicted it and things like that. And other indigenous Americans, practiced it and stuff like that. There was also a cool thing, and this ties into what Peter talked about. There's examples of burials in ancient burials in Syria. I don't have it didn't give me how ancient it was, just old. But where graves, there was evidence of a grave being exhumed. So I'm dead, I'm buried, I'm good. Somebody opened me up and crushed my skull and then put it back together again.
Wow.
And so they think that this kind of gives evidence of fearing the dead, and specifically like destroying the brain to kind of make sure the head, to make sure no brain, nothing can come of that. There's also it was really funny. We were my family was playing the fun game Fibbage, the like TV game show game that you play, and one of the questions was, what do the ancient this study at this university found that the ancient Greeks feared blank, and we all put our guesses and stuff, and the answer was zombies. And I thought that was kind of dumb, because the word zombie, it's tied to either like a specific word in West African languages, or like it's also in zombie is like a god and stuff like that. So there's several different ways it can come in, but it's clearly African in origin. So and again, there's particularities between the undead, zombies, ghouls. Like there's Draugr. Is a Draugr a zombie? I guess so. But anyway, so when I looked into it, the Greek fearing zombies, the idea of where this came from is there was an excavation and they found tombs and burials where people were nailed to the ground or nailed into their coffins, or weights were put on them, like Peter was saying. So it was a way to basically, if you reanimate, you're going to have a hell of a time trying to actually get out of your animation and stuff like that. So that was my stuff from anthropology. That, and then a BBC documentary that I watched a little bit of. It was kind of boring, but it's called 2015. It's from 2015. It's called Zombies: A Living Walking Dead. Everything's Walking Dead based from like 5 years ago. It's so annoying. I don't like The Walking Dead. I wanted to make it clear in this episode. I'm sorry, but they also talk about, there's tons of diseases that are quite real, that kind of give off if you think of a stereotypical zombie, that give off those impressions. And cannibalism is a thing too. I mean, I've talked about it several times. The book on Mongolians, Genghis Khan, that I talked about, it would mention how when Mongolians would siege a city, some of the cities that did or didn't make it, they usually have to resort to cannibalism at some point. When it's been like 3 months, you're out of food, you start looking at Tony. He's got a little bit too much on him, so you take him out. And it makes you crazy too. When you're in a point where you're driven to cannibalism. We've seen stories and heard stories of it in books. You're not like excited about it. It usually is like a tense point, so you're acting manic. And so when you do start eating people, you're in a crazy state. And if some Joe Blow walks up and is able to like talk about this or see this, or someone's able to retell the story, they're going to talk about, I went crazy and ate my friend. They're not going to.
There's also, speaking of like mental illness in this, there's also a disease, Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease, I think is what it's called.
Okay.
Where I didn't look it up before this, but people that eat people are more likely to get this disease because it can be transferred in brain tissue.
I think I've heard of this. Yeah, that sounds kind of familiar. So yeah, that's some.
It's mad cow, but it's for people.
Mad human, mad dude. But yeah, I'll kind of back it up to Haiti again and zombie. So this is I'm going to the Wikipedia here. They have an excellent section, but this is from Wikipedia. So the word zombie first was recorded in 1819 in an English account by Robert Southey of History of Brazil, and it was in the form of the word zombie without the E, so just Zombi. And the Oxford English Dictionary gives the definition or the origin as West African and compares it to the Congo word nzambi, which means God, and zumbi, which means fetish. And again, fetish doesn't always have to be sexual. Like I learned this in anthropology. Like it means, the way I describe it is, it means something has like an object has a charge that gives it value. That's my personal definition. It just gives you more value than is innately there. You can't just come upon it and get that value.
But in some cases, like fetishes can be animated. It can be brought to life.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, like voodoo dolls.
Sort of.
Sure. Yeah, having this charge in it. Yeah. And there's even a Kumbundo Portuguese dictionary which defines the word nzumbi as a spirit or a soul, or a spirit that is supposed to wander the earth specifically to torment the living. So there's some cool things there. But it really does tie into the zombie as we know it, ties into Haitian folklore. And so let me see. I don't know if I wrote it down. Oh, here we go. So how we think the word kind of got to America was during the United States occupation of Haiti in 1915 to 1934. So I don't really know the specifics behind it. I'm not going to get too into it. I'm sure it wasn't a fabulous time, but the United States did occupy, and basically it was like a kind of like a military junta, but it was the U.S. controlling Haiti, but then eventually backed off. But a lot of information and culture was exported from the country then, and soon after that, a movie would come out, White Zombie. Oh, where do I have it? Sorry, my notes are all over the place. But White Zombie, I think it's 1932, is basically the first film as we know it, like as we know kind of the zombie sensationalism. And yeah, here we go, White Zombie, 1932, and it's really cool because it's like, I think it's set in Haiti, but it uses Haitian voodoo. It's the cause. And that's really kind of where it kind of begins, at least in film specifically. And it really like it's saying zombie, it's using Haiti and things like that. Because so there's, before I go further, because I'm basically going to jump to Romero, there's a discussion in from BBC that I got called "Where Do Zombies Come From?" that talks about the connection between Haiti, slavery, and voodoo, and how there's evidence that slaveholders and even like appointed slaveholders. So sometimes the plantation would be big. The owner, the white dude who owned it, would appoint a black slave who he kind of trusted or whatever to sort of hold it over. He'd be like, "It's too hot. I'm going to go chill on the States or whatever. You hold it down." There's not really much. They couldn't really do too much. And then when he comes back, if they didn't, have the product, what would happen. Anyway, conditions were horrible, like absolutely horrible. It's hot in South Carolina. It's worse in the Caribbean, in Haiti, the little islands away from South Carolina. Think like Cuba and stuff like that, if you're not too familiar. But slaves died by the thousands. They were imported. It was cheaper just to be like, import more, just give me more, rather than to upkeep a human life. So it's absolutely horrible. But so many slaves would resort to suicide. They would just be like, no. So to help stop this, to keep their labor, their free, cheap labor source for the arduous sugar plantations, one thing that was used was the threat of zombification. So if you don't do this terrible work that's mind-numbing and day and night, and you're basically a zombie, I'm going to turn you into a zombie. Or someone will turn you into a zombie, and you will be basically, you won't be able to die. You won't be able to peacefully pass on. And I found this really ironic, because it's almost like submitting to slavery and submitting to that lifestyle. It's basically like you are a zombie. You're a sugar making zombie. And so, but that was what was used, and it was very effective in a lot of cases. Threatening to not have a peaceful afterlife is incredibly upsetting. And so that, I think, I don't have it specifically kind of here, but I'm kind of gathering that is sort of where a lot of it comes from. And the process of zombification is very voodoo. There's the powder, coup padre, I think is what it's called. The powder with the puffer toxin, the puffer fish toxin.
I didn't see what it was actually called.
I think it can be called that. It's a French word is used, but I'm sure it had many different names. But yes, yeah, it was this idea of you basically you kill someone and bring him back, and specifically, so a voodoo priest would kill someone, bring them back, and then you would be their thrall. And the idea of a thrall or a familiar, that's very ingrained in all cultures across the world. Like like necromancy, that kind of thing. That's a very familiar concept, I think, and it can be seen in several different cultures. And so we have that. We're in the 30s. Haiti, the U.S. is out, but again, they've exported a lot of the culture. We have this movie in 1932, White Zombie, which is extremely influential on a lot of things. And one of the things that it helps kind of like give the idea of, is this book. It's not The Last Man on It. I Am Legend. Yeah, that's what the book was called. Yeah, the book was called that. The first iteration of the film was not. The first iteration was called like The Last Man on Earth or something like that. Anyway. They did an 07 with Will Smith too, I believe, as well. And this one didn't quite use zombies. They were more like vampires, if you were to like really show it up to it, the way that they acted and their intelligence.
Yeah, they were like opposed to light and stuff like that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so, but it was dystopian. It was like very like the book and the movie, from what I've seen. I haven't seen the film. I hear it was all right though. Very, very like rundown apocalyptic society with creatures roaming and taking over, that kind of thing. And the creatures wanted more of the uninfected kind of people. So, that's where Romero really comes in. He even kind of, there was like a legal battle. I didn't go too much into it, but he ended up being okay. I don't want to say he won or lost, but it sounds like he didn't lose for sure. But he made his film. Was it Night of the Living Dead? Is that the first one?
Yep.
Yeah, he makes this film. Doesn't use the word zombie in the film. He kind of uses the term ghoul, which is an 18th century Arabic word, ghoul. And that word does specifically sort of mean, it comes from the Arabic word gala, to seize. And it was used in English literature as well. In 1786, William Beckford's novel Vatek, which I think is an account of Arabic language and culture. And a ghoul is specifically a creature that dwells in cemeteries and eats flesh. And I've killed tons of ghouls in video games. You usually do find them in cemeteries. They're usually like weak little dudes though. And the word ghoulish too kind of has its own term of being like gluttonous and gross. And that's actually in lots of different cultures as well. And it's also featured in 1001 Nights, which Cammie and I have touched on before too, ghouls and things like that. So it's really interesting. But yeah, so that's sort of how we get to Haitian and voodoo culture is really where we start to see, voodoo it's imported from West Africa, comes to the Caribbean and the Americas through the Atlantic slave trade, and it still kind of keeps going though. The word zombies, definitely West African and Congo origin, but the way we sort of see zombies, the way they act, comes from like the 17th, 18th, 19th century slavery, and it was it got imported into culture. I mean, there was a lot of it was featured in zombies were featured in, specifically voodoo zombification was featured in like Johnny Quest cartoons and stuff like that. So it really became like sensational, and the Pulp Fiction stuff, or like 30s, 40s, 50s, the comic books and things like that. I didn't even know this. I didn't write which James Bond movie. It's one I probably or book. I don't know if it was in a movie, but there was even a voodoo instance in James Bond. There was like a thing, and it ended up not being real.
Live and Let Die. Yeah. Roger Moore's first movie.
Oh, okay, cool. All right. So yeah, and I think I even remember like in the video games, there's like a voodoo doctor kind of dude too that you could play as. The Baron. Yeah. So
you know a lot about this, Peter.
I will run the table in James Bond trivia. Absolutely.
No, that's fantastic. Some other things that really helped it going into the 20th century, Frankenstein and H.P. Lovecraft also really helped shaped it coming into White Zombie. So White Zombie, the film in 1932, took it on a whole new level, but H.P. Lovecraft and the Frankenstein book really did also kind of change the idea of undead and zombification, and Frankenstein especially, because there was empathy and things like that regarding the creature, the undead creature. You didn't hate the undead creature. You felt sorry for the undead creature. Mm-hmm. You didn't think it deserved what it did. But Romero's slow, I'm gonna eat you. He really kind of got it, and he really did. I mean, the ghoul is a great way to think about it. Is what he made the ghouls zombies. He forever changed the ghouls into zombies. And later films would use the term zombie, and it totally just took over. Even Edgar Allan Poe even sort of talked about like undead. Oh, I forgot to mention this in my other stuff. There's even ancient Mesopotamian things. The goddess, I think Ishtar, in like an epic poem included in Gilgamesh as well, which we've talked on, mentions she's threatening to raise the dead and specifically have them eat the living. So And Frankenstein even too is based off of European folklore. So it's wild. There's no one line for zombies. There's really no one line for zombies, and it's really a mytheme, bringing that word back. Yep. Where it's this there's this sort of a mytheme is sort of this independent concept that happens in society. So these societies might not have contact with each other, but they kind of believe the same thing in a way. And so many different cultures at different times thought of zombies as we know them, just had different names and different ideas, and feared them in a lot of ways. Like I said, Peter mentioned the 13th century. That's what you said it was, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. They were tying down Draugr with iron and stakes, and ancient Greeks were doing practically the same thing out of fear of the dead, and ancient Syrians were crushing skulls just to make sure your uncle couldn't come up when you think he'd find out that you stole his jar. I don't know, but that's kind of it in a nutshell, and it really went on from there. History.com gave me some cool stuff too. I totally forgot about this word for undead, revenant. Revenant is really good. It's from Old French, which means returning. And I know I think like video games or shows have used it as like a tough zombie, basically like a strong undead creature. But that's another really kind of cool way. But yeah, throughout history you have these different concepts and different words. Like I said, ghoul. You could have told me ghoul was 7th century Arabic, and I would have been like, yeah, that makes sense. But 18th century is when it got used. So it became a thing much later, and it's all. Ghouls are also tied to jinn, which we've talked about as well, which are kind of like, which is where the word genie comes from. But jinn are typically bad spirits is the kind of a way to think of it. You can think of it as like Japanese yokai, where they could be like kid eating, but they could also be like silly and fun. The last source that I had that I really liked was from the Atlantic. I know Cammie used this one, or I started with this one and got me on it too, as well. It kind of reaffirmed the Haitian origins and the connection to deter slave suicide. It also mentions this concept of bokor, black magic. I think it's a Haitian word specifically, reminding me of sahir, which is an Arabic word for black magic as well. But yeah, and it they one thing they kind of bring in though is it's really a good way of like zombies in literature, zombies in whether you believe in them or not. It really kind of helps show human anxieties in a lot of ways too, of control and fear of dying, just fear of what's going to happen. This article mentioned it said zombie media, especially post 30s and going into the Romero age and up, it really became like a Rorschach test for humanity. And you can really see that. I mean, zombies, especially in video game, they're the perfect video game thing. And even Romero, he actually credits video games from the 90s, like Resident Evil and House of the Living Dead or whatever, as being what really helped lift zombie culture, because they're perfect. You can kill zombies all day long and there's no remorse. You know, you're doing everyone a favor in Resident Evil when you shoot a zombie. Right. So it's a really good way. Like people joke like Nazis were perfect in World War II video game and in war games in general, because like no one's upset that you're shooting a Nazi, but like even more, no one's upset you're killing zombies. No one's upset you're killing zombies. So it's this cool evolution. And even to Wikipedia goes in depth about sort of the culture change from there was the 60s and 70s and even early 80s movies, but then it really kind of died down. But then the video games are what picked it up. There was the remake of the original film, and then it kind of went up. And even now today, it's funny because what's popular today isn't so much the scary zombie film that we've seen. It's the romantic zombie is what Wikipedia says. So the where like the zombie, you know, like Kinley watched, there's a Disney musical, I can't even remember what it's called now, she'll scream but yeah, it's like a teeny boppy oh no, we're zombies. iZombies, a really funny show.
Zombie High School.
Zombie High or something like that. But iZombies really good. It's basically kind of like making it so zombies don't always have to be like a villain sort of thing, and even adds humor element to it. I mean, Shaun of the Dead did a really awesome job of like not really like making the zombies human, but just bringing the funny in it. And stuff like that. And there's a bunch of like B and C movies from other countries that also kind of used it, but played and made fun of it as well. And I thought one thing I put as a note too is in Romero's film, I thought it was really interesting. I've never seen it. In the film, the actor Dwayne Jones plays Ben. He's sort of the hero. He's the one who kind of makes it and out in the end. And he's a black man. And for this film to be in the 60s, that's kind of crazy too, because it's a mostly white cast. And then I just thought there was an interesting connection just with the history of zombies, and how it's sort of viewed in its voodoo culture being a very African and Haitian sort of thing. I just thought it was interesting that's how that was the hero of the kind of the original film that did it all. So yeah, I think I've talked for 9 minutes straight for the most part. It's such a cool subject, and like I said, there's so much you can do. We can do like independently with so many angles we can go from. But I just want you to sort of keep in mind, like, the diasporic sort of things of zombies as they keep popping up through history on their own, through different cultures in different ways. But for America, it's sort of, or for the modern zombie, I should say, the modern American zombie, maybe you could say, it's a really strong connection to Haiti. And the turn of the 20th century, the occupation of America, I think, is really where people got the ideas to get that stuff, turn it into films. Like, they were popping out films like crazy during that time, the golden age of cinema. And there were and I've heard White Zombie is not particularly great. It's in the domain, so we could do a watching of it. I don't know if I want to. But yeah, there's also some cool psychological stuff there. Zombie media from its beginnings to today, especially today, it really does try and go at an angle, talk about human anxieties. Walking Dead's a good example of, Walking Dead. I joke that Walking Dead's the show where like there's all these zombies trying to kill you, but they're like, what about my feelings? I'm like, no, what about the zombies? But that's a good point, like how you act. And I Am Legend's a really good story about that, because I read the Wikipedia page for it, and Will Smith, he talked to like POWs who were in isolation, because he's isolated in the film. And so there's this, he's really alone, and in a lot of media you're usually with someone. You usually have like a team that you can work with, but in that one it's very, you're completely alone. It's you against the literal world and stuff like that. But yeah, so I think that's it. I think I've scrolled through my notes enough. um I this was just a really cool subject, and I'm really glad I looked into it. Zombie is such a throwaway word now, and not that we take it for granted. I don't think that's really possible,
Well,
but it's cool to think about.
it does refer to something really specific. Like it refers to something very specific in like voodoo Haitian culture. But it's become this like blanket term that we really kind of use to refer to like undead in general, you know? And I think
Yeah,
that's
they're
interesting.
interchangeable. Yeah, they
Hmm.
really are like interchangeable. But even undead can sort of mean something else. Like it's really cool. There's like a lexicon of zombie. I mean, it even Wikipedia noted that eventually the zombie became its own subgenre in the horror film. Like it became that important. You couldn't just say horror
Hmm.
film. You had to say zombie horror film. And so that's how, and I, like I said, I just think of it in like video game. You're starting a video game. You're gonna first you fight the ghouls, then you fight the zombies, then you fight the revenant. It's these tiers of,
Right.
of undead that are scary and strong. But yeah, it's just super cool, and it's also a little it's a little wild. One other thing from that BBC article, "Where Do Zombies Come From?" where that kind of talked more about the Haitian stuff and things like that, is a woman, an esteemed Black novelist, Zora Neale Hurston.
Mm.
She was sort of part of the Harlem Renaissance era in the 20s and 30s, and they sort of saw New Orleans as a really strong part of that, which makes sense.
Hmm.
There's a lot of prolific Black culture that comes from there and still exhumes from there daily. And she actually, as part of this, she was a professional anthropologist, and to sort of kind of get to the roots of it, spent several months in Haiti training to be a voodoo priest, and she actually became kind of weirded out by it. And there's a lot of weirdness. She made a book called "Tell My Horse"
Hmm.
in 1937, and it's not really seen as um, good. There's no other
Super.
word.
Yeah. It's not. The scholarship is not great on it, but it's super entertaining to read. It's
Right.
wild.
Yeah, and I mean, this woman did do these things, but she left Haiti hurriedly because she thought that the secret voodoo societies of Haiti were like gonna take her out, because they were like, no,
Hmm.
you can't take our
You're taking our
secrets and things
secrets.
like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, and she took a picture of what she believed was a woman who was a zombie. She claimed she did meet a reanimated person, and the article sort of speculates it was someone who likely had suffered a social death, and so might have been dead to everyone if they
Mm.
believe she's dead. If the whole community believes you're dead, and you did, drink the pufferfish poison, your heartbeat went down, and you come back, then yeah, you're a thrall. You're just some dude's literal slave. Like you have no will or anything like that. So whether you took a picture of, I mean, I feel like someone in the 1930s who's like excommunicated from their side, he's got to look like a zombie regardless. So
Mm.
um, and it, Cammy, I was talking to you about this. Sherlock Holmes, the first film. There's that part where the whole part of the 2009 Robert Downey Jr. one is that all these freaky things are happening, and then at the end they kind of unravel what actually was happening, because it's Holmes and he does it right. And I was like, oh, I wonder if it was the pufferfish thing. I
Mhm.
was like, that would be kind of cool, but it wasn't. It's a Turkish recipe is what he uses. He like so the main antagonist, Lord Blackwood, he hangs himself, and he saves himself because he's wearing a harness, so that's why his neck doesn't
Sure.
snap, or he chokes. And before he did that, he took this concoction. It was a Turkish plant. That's all it says. Turkish plant. Screenrant.com. Thanks very much. But all it says is it was and that's what they say in the film too. It was like a Turkish remedy that he took, but it was the same effect. It makes your pulse go so low, your heartbeat so low, you're alive, but like to a trained doctor, you're not. You seem
Yeah, it's
dead.
like Romeo and Juliet.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. That's right. Oh, that's a really great way to put it. Yeah, that's a really good way to put it.
Juliet's a
I didn't
zombie.
think of that. Right. Yeah. God,
You
that's
heard
gonna
it
be
here.
Romeo and Juliet and zombies. That's totally a thing. That would be really good. Well, yeah, I think that I've covered it all for the most part.
It was
There's
a really good job. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah,
You
great
guys hit
research.
really good angles of it. 13th century like Norway and like fairly modern or industrial like Haiti.
Mhm.
That's how this goes, and they're so it's so similar. It's crazy to think about, but yeah, I think that about do it. Unless you guys have anything you want to throw out.
Rate, review, subscribe.
Yes. And if you want to
Yeah,
hear a good ghoul story, let us know. Cami and I found a really good one in the 1001 Nights. It's we should definitely circle back to
Yeah,
that
we
someday.
might do that like Halloween time or something.
we've only done 2 podcasts on 1001. We did Alibaba and Sinbad, so we got 999 more to go.
We'll do a ghoul show.
So that's most of the podcast going to be. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, please do let us know how we're doing. Let us know if let us know if you think there's something that we should have mentioned, and I'll be happy to call it out on the next show. Call us out on the next show if I goofed up something, especially too. But you can also watch us on YouTube. We're here looking at each other's eyes right now, and you can look into our eyes as we look into each other's eyes if you'd like.
So
But
dreamy.
please, yeah. Facebook group's also one of our more active communities, so join us there. You can message any of us, Cami, Bryant, or Peter, if you have suggestions or post on the group. We would love it if you have any outside suggestions, especially something that may not be well known to our Western world. And Twitter, we do have a Twitter now. Mythstorie with an IE is how you look us up. But we post fun memes, and I'll put links to the YouTubes and stuff like that there. So check us out. Cami, thank you, and Peter, thanks again as always. I guess I will see you guys next time.
Oh.
Brains.